Hello, LinkedIn. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what part of the planet you're watching this. Great to have Pawan Joshi coming and joining us again today as a continuation, from the Global Supply Chain Summit that was organized a few weeks ago. We will be talking a little bit further on the topic of sustainability and the role that technology has in supply chain sustainability. Pavan is the EVP for Product Management and Strategy. As many of you know, he works for E2Open. E2Open is the leading network-based provider of 100% cloud-based, mission-critical end-to-end supply chain management software, one of the leading companies in the space in the world. So Pavan, thanks for joining us. Welcome from US.
Thank you very much, Radu. Always a pleasure to have a conversation with you and meet with the crowd here on LinkedIn.
Our pleasure to have you. So maybe let's start with the first one, right? So in terms of sustainability, there's a lot of talk. I think there's more and more, almost every day, there's more information put out there. It's very high on the CEO list. What do you see from where you sit in terms of the executives that you talk to, and what's their views in terms of what they need to do about sustainability?
Yeah, I think this has become a very relevant topic for us. I think the two things that really put the spotlight on this topic over the last, I would say, 18 to 24 months. I think the first one is really the crisis in many ways that the world is going through, not just in the individual country. And we have realized that supply chains and the way we run our businesses are very much interlinked. We cannot think about us and our enterprises and our markets and our customers in isolation around boundaries that we've created. So that's I think the most one of the most important things. The second thing that has also become very important is we've seen a series of events that have brought things into focus. Some of them are man-made, some of them are natural, and some of them really, just given the connected nature of our supply chains and the way we do business, have made things very, very relevant around sustainability. We are realizing that the way we are doing business today and the way we are operating our companies may not be the way we should going forward in the future. And there are reasons around connectivity and connectedness and the global footprint that we have. But what it really exposes is the risk and the disruptions that can possibly happen. And some of these, like I said, are man-made and we can control them. Some of these are not man-made. And what we really quickly realize is that we have to get to a point where, as we're running our businesses, we got to go back to the fundamentals of, can we do the same, or can we do more with the same or less? And I think that is at the crux of, if we really boil this thing down to whether you call it sustainability, whether you call it efficiency or whatever it is, I think if we start focusing along those dimensions and start thinking about as human beings are progressing, as the world is moving forward, can we do the same or can we do more with the same and less? If that's our focus, then I think it puts light back into sustainability. So as I see, the C-suite, across our large global enterprises, the Fortune, the global 2000, global 5000, I think that's really resonating. And what people are really very quickly realizing is that these are not short-term fixes that can be done in a quarter or two or a year or two. There are fundamental constructs in the way we need to rethink some of this that'll last, a year, 2, 3 years, and it'll take that amount of time. And that's really what is front and center. I think if you start thinking about the executives, it is really at that level that the thought process is. We'll deal with the current and the present, with the tools and technology that we have, but how are we gearing ourselves to start thinking about the future? So if you put that into context, and turn that all the way back to the connectedness and the global footprint that we have around our operations, really the question really becomes, how do we get closer to the people, the enterprises that help us bring products to market? At the end of the day, if I'm a brand owner, and you can take any one of those brands, every single one of them relies on a series of partners to do business and bring products to market for them, whether it be around manufacturing, whether it be around logistics, whether it be around trade, whether it be around distribution, retail operations, channel distribution. The question really becomes, you need to think about sustainability inside your four walls, what you can control. But at the end of the day, sustainability is what your products are actually going through as they're being built and brought to market. So it's also, how do you think about sustainability outside your four walls in what I call your ecosystem of partners, right? The ecosystem that helps you bring products to market. And the last piece I would think about it there is, it's not just about bringing products to market in one way. It's also, how do you take, once the product has served its purpose, and bring it right back in, or at least get it back to a point where it can be reused as much as possible or recycled. So the concept of what we've been calling as a circular economy, or really being able to think about product and product life cycles in our operations holistically. I think that's really what we are thinking about and what we are seeing at that level. But very much, the fact that we got to understand, these are not, events that happen in, or transformations that will happen in months and quarters. These will take years, and in some cases even decades, to get to a steady state process.
And there's one question that came up, but I had a similar discussion with two separate executives around the topic, and you guys, E2Open is one of the great technologies out there. So from a technology perspective, the visibility, also from a tier 1, tier 2 perspective, a lot of these things are, we talk, maybe the word is too big, sustainability, but I mean, if you know how much you need, then you also save cost, you also save the transportation needed. And what is happening on the flip side is, because people don't know how much, then they hoard, right? So they hoard, there's, and the bullwhip effect, and that it's a very simple scenario that has happened a lot. And the executives that I was mentioning, they mentioned the word trust. So it's not because the technology is not there, it's because the trust in the ecosystem is not there. So then the suppliers and the clients are not trusting each other to share information, so that they would know, without that information, they can't know how much to order, right?
Yeah.
So I guess I'll ask you, have you seen ways in which, and maybe we're going a little bit, I don't want to go too philosophical, I'd like to keep it pragmatic, right? But it is about trust, right? Have you seen that work, and how have you seen it work, maybe in your experience?
Yeah, it's totally about trust. And I think at the end of the day, it is about, how do you see, one of the things at the fundamental basis, you got to realize that every one of these enterprises that exist across those, tiers in a supply chain, when you think about one product, you can think about tiers. But when you think about multiple products and you think about multiple geographies, it's not really a tier, it becomes a network, right? My customer is in some cases can become my supplier as well. And my supplier in some cases is my customer. And when you think about the interconnected nature of how businesses are, yeah, and that's really true. Like, I'll give you a very simple example. A shipping line that moves products from point A to point B in containers is probably moving, let's say, computing equipment. But the computing equipment that the computer manufacturer or the computing equipment manufacturer is actually a supplier to the operations that sustain that ocean shipping container company, right? And you got to realize that symbiotic relationship. So if I don't trust you as a supplier, why would that supplier trust you as a customer, right? So philosophically, if you think about it that way, there's an interconnectedness that always happens. Now, technology has a very important role to play, and I would argue that the reason why E2Open's been around and the reason why E2Open was established was exactly this. Back when our consortium was formed in the early 2000s, it was really formed because companies were starting to outsource their manufacturing process. In fact, they sold their factories to contract manufacturers, and this was primarily in the high-tech space. And they had to rely on the contract manufacturers to get the products done. On one side, they were collecting orders from their customers the same way they were doing, for decades. On the other side, they completely lost visibility to the manufacturing process because they no longer owned the factories. No longer, it was not vertically integrated. It was distributed across multiple tiers in terms of components and manufacturing and logistics. So the very nature of that process relies on trust. If I tell you my bill plan for the next 2 quarters is ABC, and if I second guess as a contract manufacturer and I third guess as a component supplier, I will build a lot of fat into and I'll start judging and second guessing it. So the only way to do that is what we started thinking about is, how do you actually get to what we call a single version of the truth that spans across multiple enterprises? Now, the single version of the truth doesn't mean that everybody shares the same version of the whole truth. There are slices of what is relevant to me as a supplier, as a contract manufacturer, as a brand owner, and that's where technology can step in and do that. And in many ways, the secret sauce that E2Open has is really around a permission model that allows you to run a business process across multiple tiers, and a permission model that allows you to come in and out of that business process depending on what role you play. And that really is the crux of what we've been able to achieve. So going back to your point, it is absolutely about trust, and in some cases, in a lot of cases, the technology is there, but there's also trust in the technology as well, right? So it's a trust in the platform and the approach and the technology provider, and there's absolutely a trust in terms of the partners in that supply chain ecosystem that you have. And my contention really here is technology has, over the last 10, 15, 20 years, has moved way far along, and our business processes have not. And it's the yin and yang between technology and process, right? Back in the days when MRP1, MRP2 came about, technology was not there. So we constrained our business process around what technology could do. Now that technology is leapfrogged, in so many ways, we have to unleash and unbound the constrained processes that we had, and now think about what can be done. And we got to think about, there've been so many books written, over the last 15, 20 years around the virtual enterprise. And the virtual enterprise is not me and my enterprise. It is everybody that's involved in bringing my products to market. And technology now can facilitate that. And we believe that we've been doing that, and we have the right way to do that at E2Open. There are several other peers of ours that also have something similar in terms of their approach. May not be as complete or as there, but at the end of the day, not everything needs to or should or will run on E2Open, and the openness needs to exist. But philosophically, it comes back to trust. It always comes back to trust, and technology is one way to actually facilitate that trust, where you're not second guessing, where you believe in the data as you're providing it to somebody else, and you know how that data is going to be consumed, how you will participate in the business process with clear lack of with clear clarity around and transparency around what it does and what role you play. And that the only way you'll be able to sustain that process as a brand owner is to be able to give some assurance to the partner that's providing you that there is some amount of sustained business and some amount of sustained usage there. And that's the nature of how I think this is going to evolve. It's going to take time. I think we see pockets of this across different functions, across different industries, across different parts of the supply chain. I think you don't see the ubiquitousness across the board. I keep saying, the future is already here. It's just not equally distributed. As there have been several people that have kind of stated that. A lot of our innovation is actually in practice right now. It's just that it's not distributed widely enough to become, a common practice. But it is going to get there. I think technology is definitely going to facilitate that.
And to your point,
exactly that. And in my mind, sustainability is exactly that. I think we should not think about sustainability as yet another thing. It's a part of the same thing, right? Efficiency, produce like I said, more with
if you run, and if you run your supply chain more effectively, ultimately you're bound to be more sustainable because you're utilizing less resources. It's a very simple cut. We don't need to get very theoretical about it. And to the point with processes and technology, I've gotten this request from a few executives. That's also the reason why we launched recently our training division, because it's almost like we're reaching a point where supply chain professionals are not aware of what technology can do for them. So of course, if you're not aware, then you can't design the process that would enable your organization and unleash the full potential of it. So it's a funny, now it's so advanced that we need to educate the people of what they can do with it. So it's a different side of the equation. But I'll pull a question that's very good from Felix, and I'll flip it to you because there's quite a few people that are wondering or kind of have these doubts, right? In this expectation, total ownership cost, will it go down? Will it go up? Is it a short term go up and long term go down? How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, you see, I think the way I think about this is nobody's measuring the cost and then this equation the way it is written up right now, right? So there's no baseline today. So if we establish a baseline, my argument always is the moment you start measuring something, you'll start making sure that measurement and that particular activity trends in the right direction when it comes to measurement. Part of the problem is we don't measure, right? We don't measure, we don't have a KPI for sustainability, right? When we look at our traditional performance metrics, let's take logistics as an example. Most of our metrics are on time info, right? Nobody talks about, okay, what was the cost to actually achieve that? in that context straight away. That might become a third measure of yours, a third, fourth measure of yours. But as a supply chain person, you need to talk about, did the right product get to the right place at the right time? And is there a sustainability metric around there? Probably not. Is there a cost metric around there? Yes, but it comes, a little bit later. But if we actually combine it all together and start measuring it, I'm absolutely sure that that equation is going to trend down. And it is going to trend down the moment. I mean, sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? The moment you shine light on something, we know what it is. We know, we start digging into what is driving it in the wrong direction or the right direction, and then we start peeling it off. It's the very nature of how we approach, solving problems. If we discover a problem, we'll solve it. And going back to that specific equation, I totally believe that if we start thinking about the true circular nature of building products and bringing products back once they've been used, we can take cost out of this in a tremendous thing. And when I talk about cost, it is really comes back to doing more with less. That's really at the crux of it. So yes, you might be spending more at some part of it, but the overall effect of that is much higher. It trends in the right direction. Like a great example of this is, should you in the keynote Q&A, I touched upon sustainability and equated that to the quality movement, and I strongly believe that that's how we should think about it. Back when Deming and Taguchi and a lot of the leaders around quality started talking about quality, the natural reaction was, hey, it's going to increase cost. But today, nobody talks about quality because it's a part of our thinking. It's a part about our process. That's how I do it. And the whole concept there was, if you boil it down, it was do it right the first time. That was the whole idea of quality. And if you do it right the first time, yes, you might spend a little more time and effort and cost doing right the first time. But once it gets done correct the first time, you never have to bother about it, because you put the right measurements in place to course correct it, to change you got the right run curves in place to make sure your machine stays within tolerance. You got the right technology processes to continue to measure. You do sampling, quality, lot sizes coming out of your processes outside of your thing. And all of a sudden you realize that quality is not a cost thing. It actually helps you save cost. And it's just that we never measured it holistically. Right? We never measured the cost of rework. We never measured the cost of return products. We never measured the cost of our products of bad quality not being sold as over competitors until you started measuring that. So I think I look at sustainability exactly in the same way. If we start thinking about it more holistically and start thinking about, okay, maybe we spend a little bit more upfront. Forecasting is a great example. You talked about it. If you knew exactly what somebody would buy and what you would want and what you need to support that buying process, why would you waste anything? Right? But the process, it starts right there. And we've seen it actually at E2 Open. We've seen a lot of our customers realize that the problem around sustainability doesn't start with the execution side. It actually starts with the planning side. It starts with sensing what is really needed, and that's the tip of the sword. And if we do it the right way, kind of coming back to that equation, yes, you might spend a little more upfront in terms of cost, but the overall equation starts to trend down in terms of cost or in terms of effectiveness as you start looking at it more holistically.
Pawan, to the topic of sustainability, right? I mean, it's such a big beast, and we spoke, and I remember even more to the panel where it was linked to KPIs and how do you put measurements and how do you know you're on track? Because again, there's sometimes you can get boggled down in fluff. Give us some perspective, because to your point, yes, quality is a great example. Now we take it for granted. How will this play out for sustainability? Have you seen some of your clients, maybe some of the better examples, right? How do they measure that they're doing the right things?
Yeah, I think the way I see this getting operationalized, Radu, is we can talk about the metrics that we want to strive towards that are big and lofty, but I think it takes us away from understanding how we get there, right? And there's a slowly increment, I think, a step function, step by step, that we need to get there. I think we need to look at it along two dimensions. One is, how do we improve what we're doing today, the way we are doing today? And I would talk about it in terms of functional improvements, right? How do we actually functionally improve our logistics process? How do we reduce empty miles, as an example? How do we make sure that when we are selecting our partners and when we're moving products around, we're picking it from the right partners that have the right sustainability footprint? How do we know we're engaging with the better distributors and distribution process? How do we know How are we measuring that our inventories are not getting built up? How do we know our excess and obsolescence is coming down, right? These are all measures that are traditional measures, but they're not always counted in the context of sustainability. They're counted as, another part of something that you want to achieve. But if you tie it all together and start thinking about, are we moving forward along these traditional KPIs that have some reflection on sustainability, it helps us improve these individual functions. And then you start thinking about another layer, another view of that sustainability that goes across functions. And this is where the example I always give is around planning versus execution, right? The reason why a lot of companies expedite product is because their forecasting process and sensing process is either not good or is not in line with the execution process, or it's happening, way too infrequent. Right. So we do a lot of work with some of our customers that have realized that the real value of improving planning processes doesn't come from plan accuracy. It actually comes from saving cost on the logistics side and execution side. Why? Because now I have the ability to look at really forecast in terms of two dimensions. One is, what is my baseline forecast that I have a high degree of assurance that I'll actually always sell, and what's the variability associated on top of that? Once you start thinking about it that way, you can then take your base forecast, high degree of probability that you'll sell that, and start level loading your factories. When you level load your factories, you run longer production runs. You are able to have better buying patterns. Your buying patterns and your replenishment patterns into the factories using, for logistics become more sustainable, right? And when you start thinking along those lines, the production that happens and then the movement of the finished goods into geographies can then move over longer lead time, lower carbon footprint ways, i.e. ocean, as an example. And then for the variable part, you can rely on, the short-term things where you cannot forecast. So there's higher degree of variability around that forecast. You can use more expedited ways to do it. Think about air freight. Think about more spikes in your production plans and alternate things. When you do that, all of a sudden your holistic planning process starts driving more holistic execution process, and that becomes more sustainable. Now I can take, a lot of our customers have actually taken a lot of the planning efficiency is actually reflected in lower freight costs, because now I can take a lot of my production and instead of moving it over air, I can move it over ocean. Instead of moving it over air, I can move it over ocean and road, and that gives me more flexibility. I can reduce my empty miles if I'm better managing my containers. So those are all ways, if you think about the second dimension, where you're not thinking about functional improvements, you're thinking about cross-functional improvements. And that, I think, is a step-by-step way to get to making sure that sustainability becomes a part of your day-to-day operations, not as an overlay that somebody comes and says, okay, I'm the sustainability champion. Here are the KPIs that I want to measure. And then I measure it for a year or two. And when that champion moves away, those KPIs fall apart because they're not a part of your regular process. We've seen that over and over again. And I think sustainability is such an important topic that I believe that you need to make sustainability sustainable. Right? It has to become a part of the operation. And if it is not a part of the operation, then, it's just another thing, an overlay part of it.
I'll pull this good question that came through from James. Does information sharing along the supply chain require any extra legal protections? What do you think?
Well, I think there are enough existing constructs out there that allow us to share information, even today. We've been doing that at E2Open. We've got a trading partner network of about 220,000 trading partners that share information, every day, every second, every millisecond. And there are existing legal constructs that actually allow you to support that information sharing process. And most importantly, there's technology to make sure that that information that is being shared with the right partners. It's not being shared broadly. I mean, the technology and the legal constructs exist there. Now, there might be certain other areas where we might need to develop them, where we've not thought about how and what sustainability information we share and how we want to restrict it. So my contention is that I think there is enough out there today for us to do a lot. And I don't think our legal constructs will constrain, or lack thereof will constrain our progress in this dimension. I think there's so much that exists out there. There's so much information that we're already sharing, in the existing legal constructs, that we should be able to do, 50, 60, 70% of what we can do today, right? Or what we want to do. Whether it is enough for us for the next 20 years, don't know. But I'm pretty sure that once the momentum builds up in this, we'll figure out a legal way to make sure that that information gets shared. And if there's technology that needs to be built to support that, absolutely. I think technology has now reached a point where it will become an enabler. And if we discover use cases, there's enough horsepower there to help us solve those.
Good point. Let's double click a little bit on case studies, Pawan. So maybe you can share, one or two. I mean, not necessarily, you don't need to share the names if you don't want, but of some of your clients that are using this latest tech, software, hardware to achieve better results in their goals around sustainability.
Yeah,
and how? Maybe specific, yeah.
Yeah, I'll give two types of examples, right? Kind of coming back to the KPIs and the evolution of those that I was talking about. Right. One great example is reduction of empty miles. We do a lot of work on the ocean shipping side of the world, with some of the largest carriers and forwarders in the world, and they're moving a large amount of freight in empty containers. And right now we talk on containers, and right now we're talking about how constrained that environment is. When we started this journey I would say about 7-10 years ago, the big thing there was how do you reduce empty containers, right? And the traditional process was you take a full container from a destination port, take it in, wherever it needs to go to the destination, unload that container and bring the container back to a yard, which typically was near a port. And then you take that empty container out to wherever it needs to go to get filled up again, and then bring it back to the port and terminal, load it up into a ship and go. So, there are the companies both on the brand owner side that use those containers, as well as on the ocean shipping side that own those containers, where there's value for us to reduce those empty miles. And some of the technology that we built, around what we call Aventita today, allows us to reduce that. And a lot of ocean carriers and a lot of brand owners are using that technology. And the whole idea here is, as I'm taking a full container inland into the DC, I have the ability to say, hey, I'm going to drop this container at this location. Is there any other pickup point where I can drop that empty to closer to that region? And if there is, I can drop that container there, and I can come either bring that truck back empty, or I can have the truck wait there for that container to be filled up and brought back empty. Now, there's tremendous amount of sustained carbon footprint reduction in that process, and tremendous amount of value creation, right? Because there's driver efficiency, and again, in this constrained environment, that becomes really important. Your drivers are not driving empty containers back and forth. You basically reduced 2 legs of an empty container going back and forth. So there's tremendous amount of value creation there, and there's, most importantly, tremendous amount of revenue sharing also that happens there, because there's efficiency with the trucking company, with the brand owners, as well as the ocean carrier. So there's footprint there. I talked about some of the planning versus execution efficiency. A lot of our customers, as they're improving their forecasting process and inventory management process, what we're really doing is making sure that we're not driving inventory to the last and final destination, and then dealing with excess coming back. Really designing the network of distribution in an efficient fashion, so that you're waiting till the last moment and then running the most efficient distribution process based on what you're seeing, and being able to forecast more accurately. We have our demand sensing technology. We run a forecast benchmark study every year, and we've demonstrated year over year our forecast accuracy is market leading there, and we're happy to share that with anybody that wants to see that benchmark study. But the whole idea here is kind of coming back to the point that you started this discussion with, Radu, is if you know who's going to buy and how much they're going to buy and when they're going to buy, it streamlines all your operations upstream. And that's the whole concept. And if you're able to forecast better, you're able to distribute better, you're able to manufacture better, you're able to deploy the right logistics. And that's at the tip of the spear in our mind, is how do you actually do that? And a lot of our customers that actually start there with better forecast and demand sensing, drive that back into better inventory and inventory positioning and inventory management around thresholds and safety stocks. And then from there, be able to run the right supply processes and deal with the constraints that come, right? And the constraints today, in this day and age, not only come from material constraints around components, they come from supply constraints around capacity, but most importantly, that top of mind for everyone is logistics constraint around moving products around or components around. So when you can considered those three together in a supply constrained supply demand supply balancing process, a lot of our customers have been able to look at concepts around how do you get to a baseline forecast around which you can run a steady state loaded process and then deal with the variability as a separate thing. That, in my mind, is the biggest unlock around sustainability, because that drives, kind of coming back to it, make sustainability as a part of your operation, because you're really trying to do more, if not the same, with less. And that is at the crux of it. We may not have a KPI for it directly. It says, okay, the sustainability meter moved from 1 to 10, but we know that we're using less, or we are becoming more efficient, and that really becomes a part of how do you actually make it more sustainable.
Now, great point. And as we're drawing to an end, but I just wanted to kind of build upon what you said, because this reminded me of a conversation I had with an Amazon early executive. I think he was chief of staff actually of Jeff Bezos, and he was top 50 employees. And he was saying that one of the many reasons that Amazon is so successful is because they're very careful on what they measure. And he gave me the example, okay, at Amazon, nobody gives a hoot about the revenue. They don't measure based on did we achieve 20 billion versus 2018 the other quarter. They don't care. That's not the primary goal. If they hit that, and usually they do, great. But what they measure and what they care about, are we taking care of our customers? Are the customers coming back and buying again? Because if you think about it, back to your point, the crux of it, you're going to make more revenue as long as the customer comes back.
Yeah.
The moment the customer goes away, yeah, maybe you sold him through some sort of offer, but if they don't come back, then what's the point, right? You're going to do a great quarter, but long term it's not sustainable. So same, I just wanted to add that example to the topic of if your planning is better, the forecasting is better, the less the amount of logistics traveling around, the less warehousing space, the less you're producing ultimately, right? And maybe wasting because nobody's buying the goods. All of this ends up being sustainable.
Yeah, and absolutely right. And I think as you're doing that, I think there are other areas also we can start focusing on, right? We didn't touch on anything a lot on product design, but there's a lot we can do on product design, and how products are designed in many ways drives how they're manufactured. So there's tremendous amount of opportunity there. In fact, design for manufacturing and design for sustainability, design DFX, I think is a big area that we talked a lot about, about 20 years ago, when I was in, getting into grad school, a lot of projects, actually 25 years ago, a lot of projects in that area. It's kind of moved away a little bit. I think we've lost from a supply chain standpoint. I think some of those concepts need to come in. And when you start thinking about design for sustainability, I think there's tremendous amount of improvements that we can do around packaging. The amount of, when you buy something new, the amount of packaging that it comes with, do you really need that? I think there's some amount of that focus that can be brought in, and that also helps improve and drive more efficiency in the supply chain. The less steps you have in the manufacturing process and the handover process, the more efficient it becomes. This tremendous, I cannot be more excited for our space than I am now, because I think the light is finally shining on the fact that there's so much more we can do. And most importantly, it is shining on the fact that this is such a critical part of what is needed to run the world, the global economy. And we are now at a point where I think the technology is pushing us to start changing the way we are doing things. And I think this focus on sustainability also drives a very positive driver for this change, because it also helps us do our work better. I think David Bauer in his thing said, we didn't inherit the world, from our earth from our ancestors. We are actually borrowing it from our future generation. And I think if we keep that at the crux of it and start thinking about the supply chains and our business operations in that context, it puts everything into light. The less we use to continue our human progress further, I think that progress will further help us reduce the impact on the world and make our operation more sustainable. And the more sustainable we are, the more we can do with it, the more we can do with what's available to us. And I think that really is, at the end of the day, the crux of it.
Well said. Love the passion, Pawan. Could not agree more. We are in good times. If nothing else, this crisis, it's done some other positive things, but definitely it put supply chain on the map, and that's awesome. As always, extremely insightful having you. Thanks for the time, and keep up doing the great work at E2Open and helping companies be more sustainable.
Thank you very much, Radu. Appreciate the platform here, and thank you everyone for your support. Look forward to meeting.